for whatever reason, the movement did not have legitimacy if it was all about us.
I'm like freezing up because I'm like speaking to the problem of why it's hard to be personal.
I say storytelling and sexual assault in the same sentence. You're going to think that I'm asking you to tell me a story about a time that you were harmed, and that has to change.
How do we tell stories about sexual violence prevention when one of the biggest storytelling hurdles is in the name itself? People in the anti-violence movement do such inspiring work. Whether that's standing alongside a survivor during some of the hardest moments of their life, helping youth find the words to voice their boundaries and needs, or fighting to change unfair systems that cause harm. But those stories, that inspiring work, rarely makes it out of our movement spaces. People know what sexual violence is, but they don't know what it means to end sexual violence. When it comes to sexual assault, the only stories people see are those of harm, pain, maybe resilience, but never solutions. At least, not in a way that inspires action. Stories of survivorship are powerful. They deserve to be told when survivors want to tell them. They're also not the only stories of our movement. The conversation you're about to hear is a recording of a live podcast from the National Sexual Assault Conference, where Valor's 3 podcast hosts, Valor Conversations, LEAP, and, of course, PreventConnect, got into our issues with storytelling. From why it's so hard to tell our stories to where we could go if we shared a little bit more, as well as a few stories of our own, coming up in this episode of PreventConnect.
Janae, I'm going to ask the question you were going to ask because I just feel like we're going there. Another conversation we were having is, why are folks so averse to having personal conversations about the work that they do? We were interviewing folks and sort of hearing people were trying to be palatable. It was almost like they felt like they had to do this interview for their job or for their manager. And Janae, you mentioned you're the writer, you're the producer, you do all the things. And I want to acknowledge I'm the writer and I'm the host, but I don't produce the podcast. And so I'm able to slowly work on the stories that people are telling me, and to curate something that's really intentional and slow. Whereas Janae, you're like surefire, just like shooting these podcasts out. And so
Treasure in different ways.
Yes, absolutely. Very different things. So I just want to acknowledge that. But because of that, because I'm doing this so slowly, I'm able to support people in telling their stories in a personal and vulnerable way. Whereas I think sometimes, Janae, you're like, all right, let's figure this out. And you never know if people feel comfortable yet. So what I've been able to do is interview people just about their stories first. Like, what is something that you've been wanting to talk about that you can't talk about at work? Because I want to get to the deep stuff. And so if people feel comfortable, right? And of course, we don't want this to be trauma porn. We don't want this to be, tell me your worst, most traumatizing story, because that's what folks often have done to survivors for so long. And so we don't want to replicate that with women of color in the field. But of course, getting folks to tell their stories first and then getting into it and being like, all right, I'm seeing some themes here. Will you allow me to ask you these questions and get that approval, get that permission? I'm like, I have my advocate lens on, and every single time people have said yes to me, and I'm always in shock and in awe. But I just want to acknowledge too, like, I think people are often afraid of what their funder is going to say if they say the honest truth. They're afraid of what their management team is going to say if they're talking about the internal dynamics within their organizations. And so I want to be delicate with those stories, but also put that out there for folks who are interested in podcasting and telling honest, vulnerable stories that don't often get told.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And I think there are multiple pieces to this. So I will answer one, and then I'd love to hear, Leah, what you have to say as well. I remember my first job in the movement, and I went to a 40-hour training like we all do. And the first thing that I heard, which I understand, was, this is not about you. We have worked so hard to remove ourselves and center our clients that we've removed the human aspect completely. when I talk to advocates about what they do, they're talking in words that people do not understand. It's because we want to be taken seriously. And it's because we're so afraid of taking up too much space and causing harm and trauma porn that we just don't say anything. It's because we don't know what storytelling looks like. If I say storytelling and sexual assault in the same sentence, you're going to think that I'm asking you to tell me a story about a time that you were harmed. And that has to change. If you work in this movement, you know that there are so many other stories. There's a story about when you go to city council. There's a story about when you pushed really hard to get someone the care that they deserved. There's a story about when you were doing sex ed or when you were working with a youth that you really connected with. No one hears that because we don't have the skills to tell those stories because we've removed ourselves so completely in order to be taken seriously because we're afraid that people are going to think that we're out to cause hell, that we're out to get revenge, that people don't know who we are anymore. And Leah, I would love to hear your experience too, because I know when we were chatting about this conversation about why people are scared to tell their personal stories, you brought a lot in about like the historical context to all of that too.
Yeah, given the fact that sexual violence is so prevalent and pervasive, you can't really avoid the fact that there are probably a lot of advocates who are actually survivors, right? Nevertheless, when you are an advocate, you can't make the advocacy about yourself. And so I know that historically, you have to be ready to be an advocate. So there are a lot of survivors who move into wanting to do this kind of work. Many of us come to our activism from our own experience. Makes a lot of sense. But all of our organizations, our agencies on the ground, one of the first things that we're screening for is this person ready to be an advocate, or are they still trying to work out some of their own stuff and thereby putting themselves ahead of the survivors, right? So it's we understand that it's important that we're able to compartmentalize and know when we're there on behalf of someone else so that we are not blurring or enmeshing boundaries with survivors with our own experiences, right? So we make that kind of sharp break. I think also too, it's the thing where for whatever reason, the movement did not have legitimacy if it was all about us, right? So that the work and the way in which we represented the work became too subjective, or it was about, an individual who was speaking on their own behalf and not objective enough to be able to represent a movement, personal as political, right? Having said that, clearly we all have our own experiences and much of our work is fueled by our own experience. But that doesn't mean that advocates don't have stories, which is what we want to spend some time having conversations with all of you today, right? There's the stories that we have as survivors, but what about the stories we have as advocates? And is there a way to elevate the work that all of you do each and every day that is really rewarding, really powerful, life-changing? Is there a way to elevate those stories as a way of making it okay to bring the issue of sexual violence into the light?
You're listening to PreventConnect, the podcast bringing together voices from across the movement to end gender and power-based violence, to give you the tools to practice primary prevention in your daily life and at work. We're highlighting emerging research, promising strategies, and stories from on-the-ground prevention practitioners doing this work in new and innovative ways. Bringing you topics like foundational strategies to prevent violence, primary prevention and youth engagement, critical race theory and school climates, prevention in a digital age, and more. I'm your host, Janae Sargent, and this is PreventConnect.
Stories of how we got started?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. You want me to go first?
You go for it.
We're going in the Wayback Machine. Okay. I needed a job. And I was right out of school and I needed a job. And a friend of mine, perhaps you know her name is Sandra Henriquez, said, well, and I just graduated from school. And she says, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm going to go do some volunteer work over at this agency that teaches children's storytelling. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it was a program that was about working with children in storytelling. And Sandra said, don't go over there. Come over here. You can start as a volunteer and we might have a position that's going to be opening up later on down the road, but you got to learn the issue. And I was like, rape and battering. I'm not coming over there to do all that stuff, but those people, I was like, please, people who, I can't even remember the stupid thing that I said, the stupidness, the heights of it. I think I said something to the effect of battered women, they must like that stuff. Otherwise, why would they stay? And then I think I said something like, rape victims, well, what do they expect? Look at what they're wearing. Why are they out doing what they do? Mind you, I was 20.
Proof that people can change, though.
Well, so the good thing that Sandra saw that, and Sandra just said something to the effect of, shut up, don't be stupid, just come over here and keep your mouth shut. I'll never forget that. And I did. I came over, I started volunteering, and it was probably on rape night. We break up the training sessions into like sexual assault, survivor stories, sexual assault, medical, sexual assault, legal, right? Depending on how your training is structured. And it was on sexual assault survivor night that a woman who would come in and tell her story told a story that sounded really familiar. And I felt my eyes opening up really big. And I was like, oh my God, that happened to me. And of course, I didn't call it rape. And that was a life-changing moment for me in that moment, that hearing someone's story kind of turned a light bulb on for me. And, once you are awakened to certain things, you can't go back to sleep. And that was in 1989 and I'm still around. So
you told a story. Now I'm like, damn, what's my story going to be? I don't know.
Stupid at the beginning and controversial?
Yes, but not in that way. I was stupid in that I was like very condescending towards my mom. I was like, I'm a feminist now. You can't tell me I can't wear that. I went off to college. My mom was like, you can't be showing your boobs, Marcy. Don't be wearing those short shorts at school. And I was like, Mom, they can't see anything. What are you talking about? So I went to the women's center where everybody was like, yeah, Marcella, you can be a feminist and be fighting with your mom all the time. I'm now like much more soft with her and now she listens to me. But yeah, I was just an angry feminist, and needed to find people that were also angry feminists. So I went to the women's center, obviously. But really, I think what kept me there was I went to a party in my hometown and a young girl was sexually assaulted at the party. And my best friend went up there and she's like, I'm also a survivor, and like started telling her story. And I was like, this feels really wrong. It's not about you. But I don't know how to tell you this and also support her. So I left the party kind of being like, okay, I feel like I didn't do enough for her. And so I went back to my women's center. I talked to the director there and she was like, are you okay? And I was like, why are you asking me if I'm okay? She's the one that's not okay. But she started talking to me about, no, she shouldn't have been, inserting herself in that story. She should have been asking her how she was doing. What did she need? And I was like, okay, so I was right. I was on the right track, but I didn't quite get there. And so I just kept going back because I had so many questions about how to support my friends that kept coming out as survivors, either of child sexual abuse or had gone on a date and didn't feel like they didn't feel like they could call it sexual assault. And so I was like, how can I start having nuanced conversations with people that don't identify, but that have experienced this form of violence? As time went on, I kept going back to spaces where we were talking about survivorship, talking about healthy relationships. And I moved into talking more about how can we create culture change? How can we change social norms? And those were the conversations that really interested me and kept me around, because I was like, I can't just stay here talking about trauma. What can we do? I kept meeting people like all of you, and I have not left yet. So that's my story.
I'm so glad you're here. I had a really similar introduction in young adulthood and childhood to, I think, a lot of people in this movement. I grew up, our parents were not really around, and I started noticing things happening to all of us and that they weren't isolated incidents. And the world talked about them like isolated incidents. And with the information that I had when I was 15, I was like, okay, I guess this is a thing that happened and is happening, and I want that to change. So the answer is to tell everybody and anybody what happened to me in as much detail as I possibly can, and allow myself to be tokenized and take up space where I don't need to be taking up space. That was a part of my healing journey. And I acknowledge that, and I own that. I also remember looking around at a really young age and being like, this feels like a pattern. I don't feel like this is only my experience. And it feels like something is causing this, but I don't have the language to point out what that is. I feel like I'm close to seeing something deeper, but I just don't get it. And no one will listen to me. I was a journalist before I came into this work. I knew that stories got people to listen because when I was 15, rooms full of people would listen to me. I wasn't really thinking about what they did when they left, but they were like, your story impacted me. So I left feeling like I did a good job. I was a journalist for a while, and I remember having a conversation with my editor because I had told him that I was thinking about leaving journalism. He said, well, what do you want to do? And I was like, I want to make, again, problematic white feminist, okay? I was like, I want to make people's lives better. I want to make things better for people. And he was like, what does that even mean? Like, you need to pick a thing, pick a cause. And I was like, but I want all the causes. And I didn't know. I didn't have a name for what I wanted to do. I know he was not speaking my language. I was not speaking his. And I'm also like, okay. But years later, I moved to the town that I'm now living in to work at the news station there. And I felt like I needed to do more. I wasn't feeling fulfilled at the news station. So I signed up for the 40-hour training to be a volunteer at the local DD organization. And I remember the moment that someone from prevention came in and told the river story, which it's a story. It didn't name anyone's names. If you haven't heard the river story, go to PreventConnect.org and you can watch a recording of it.
You thought I was just going to mention the river story and not tell you? Like this isn't an episode literally about storytelling? No, I got you. The river story, or what a lot of people know as the moving upstream story, is told a few different ways, depending on who's telling it or where you've heard it. But the gist is always the same, that at some point, if we want to see long-lasting change, we have to look up from the problem in front of us and think a little bit more creatively. It's an early morning on a regular day in a town nestled in the trees right next to a riverbank. A person is walking down to the river to get some water. When they reach the riverbank, they hear yelling. As they break through the clearing, they see a man being swept downstream. Panicked, they dive into the river to help. Both wet and tired from fatigue, they pull the man to shore. They check him, make sure that he's okay. They take him back to town to get some care. He's a little beaten up, shaken up for sure, but he'll be fine. So grateful, he thanks the person for their help, and they say goodbye. The next day, that same person returns to the river and sees two more people being swept downstream. This time, they know they can't save both, so they call for help. Every day from there on out, day in and day out, neighbors and family rush to the river to save people being swept downstream. Some stay there overnight, some take shifts, Some make food for volunteers. It's exhausting. And they can't save everyone, but they're trying. One day, one of the neighbors looks up and says, "There has to be a reason this is happening. I'm going upstream to check it out." A few miles up the road, there's a hole in a bridge where people are falling through. They run back to town to get more people together to try to patch it. While they're working on the bridge, the days are longer, the resources are thinner. They even have to ask for help from a neighboring town. But in the end, they do patch the bridge, and people stop being swept downstream. Obviously, a bridge and sexual violence are not interchangeable. A bridge is just a little bit less complex and nuanced. But moving upstream is a parable to understanding that all things have a cause. And where there is a cause, there is a solution. Now, not all solutions are going to be as simple as patching a bridge. But if we don't look up from the crisis we are in presently and dare to imagine a solution, even just to try, we will never know a different reality.
The first time in my life, I felt like things shifted into place. And I was like, what happened not only to me, but to so many people was it didn't happen in a vacuum. There were things that could have been done earlier. I've changed a lot since then. That was a few years ago. And, later on, we'll talk about like positionality and whiteness in storytelling. I think that that's really important for those of us who are white taking up space to think about our stories, where they do good, where they do harm. But I have felt so grateful to be a part of this movement. I feel like I've done so much personal growth. I've learned to shut up, and I shut up for a long time. But then I think what's really important for white folk is, fine, shut up, but then you need to speak up. We have to start being more brave. We can't be embarrassed of our problematic origin stories because we all have them. And now I think about my voice in this movement and how I can strategically and intentionally use it to advance the movement without taking up space where I don't need to.
Thank you. I mean, someone earlier in the session earlier was saying, you can't be afraid to be wrong. It's a symptom of white supremacy to want to be perfect all the time. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's true. I don't want to be wrong, but I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do it. So I appreciate you being like, shut up, but then speak up, because it can be really frustrating when white folks stay quiet forever and they're still thinking about how to be perfect. And I'm like, just say the thing. Just say the thing. All right. Well, you said we're going to talk about positionality, so let's just do it now. Shall we? How does positionality impact the way that y'all host? For me, I'm a Latina. I'm Mexican. Daughter of immigrants, grew up in Orange County. Very important to point that out because I'm sorry. It's so embarrassing. But I feel like I have to say that because I'm from the suburbs and people will be like, so your mom makes tamales? And I'm like, no, she makes kombucha. The kids at school would come over and be like, what's that smell? And I'm like, that's my mom's drink. But yeah, I feel like I need to position myself in that sometimes because as a host, I feel like I have a lot of power in the way that I'm in some ways we are telling people's stories. Sure, we're, once again, I'm answering the question, but I feel like for me, I feel like I have to understand that I have a lot of power in the way that I'm telling people's stories. Because, logistically, we are recording people's voices. We are deciding which part of the recording that we're going to use and putting a script over it to add context. And are we erasing something from a story that's really important? Are we uplifting a piece of the story that's really important? Or are we doing what sometimes journalists will do? And I think you probably know more about this, Janae, is twisting a story in a way that's not telling the truth. That's not uplifting the story, but maybe is just uplifting a soundbite that's not indicative of a larger story. So I think for me, I have to be conscious. Yes, I'm a Latina, and sure that comes with oppression, but living in the suburbs comes with privilege as well. And so I have to be conscious of not romanticizing the struggle for folks that have lived experience with that. Whereas maybe I don't have that much of that. So, yeah.
I think for me, when I am facilitating a story, the rolling out of a story, I really see myself as the facilitator or as the coach or as the excavator. It's not a great word. It's very anthropological, and we know that that's problematic too. But as I'm the one that it's not about me. It's about your story. And I'm there to guide you. And that's an agreement. That's a tacit agreement between the storyteller and myself, that I'm like guardrails. I'm alongside a road that you're going to travel. And, I just kind of make sure that we stay on the road. And if we veer off the road, we veer off the road. And then, I get to figure out later on, with your permission, whether I can use aspects of, kind of going off the road or not. I really see storytelling from in terms of my position as the person that facilitates the telling of the story. I really see myself as, let me take a step back. I see storytelling as a way of understanding the world. Okay, we tell stories, and we have done it for millennia, as a way of making sense of the chaos in the world. There's a whole bunch of random stuff that happens in the world. And just the articulation of the randomness does not make a story. It's when we select specific elements and we assemble them in a particular order, right? We articulate them in a particular way, we have a story. And that the telling of the story and the consuming of the story creates light, right? It is illuminating. So we tell stories because it's, it gives meaning to the chaos in our day-to-day lives. So, you all just have stories that you could tell about going out last night for dinner, or people that you've run into in the hallways here. You are late for work one day and somebody says, "What happened to you?" You say, "Let me tell you what happened on the way to work," right? There's certain minutiae you leave out, but there are certain key elements that you include because they make sense. They help everybody hearing it make sense of why you were late to work, right? So it's my task in the position that I'm in, certainly along identity affinities, but also as someone that wants to create the space for the stories to be told, to nurture you into being able to pull out those elements, organize them in a particular way that create light, that help us make sense. And I must create a space or an environment where there's trust, because people telling their stories are giving gifts. And, if you give gifts and you mistreat them, you don't get them again. That's totally users. But you want to appreciate the gifts that people give. So it's really important in whether it's podcasting or journaling or slam poetry or writing song lyrics. People are giving gifts by sharing a truth that helps us make sense of the world, that is illuminating.
Well, when I first started on the PreventConnect podcast, I thought it was my job to write questions and ask people those questions and pick some cool music and record an intro and put it up once a month to meet a grant requirement. And hopefully people liked that. I don't know. No one ever told me if they did. I'm assuming they didn't. It's changed quite a bit since then in subtle ways, right? I think now with my positionality, I could talk about a lot of things about my identity. I could talk about being queer. I could talk about being young. I could talk about being a preventionist. I think I want to talk about white supremacy and how I try to use my positionality to break that down. So I was raised by a single dad, and he raised me to act like a man because that was the only way that he knew that I could succeed. And I didn't have any women in my life. And when I entered the workforce and when I entered this movement, I caused a lot of harm without knowing that I was causing harm. And I think about, especially as a manager, I caused harm. And I think about new managers that might also be doing that, people who might be doing that and saying like, well, I'm not racist, so like I'm not doing anything. But my perfectionism, my demanding perfectionism of other people, my demanding hyperproductivity of other people, those things were harming without me realizing it. And I think about how I can put those stories into my podcast, as well as asking questions and uplifting voices. Those are both part of it. We're not saying to go out there and just tell your story and only your story. But every time I have an episode, now I sit down before I write the questions and I think, what do I want people to get from this episode? And I'll start drawing. I'll start writing. I'll journal. I won't just write questions, and I'll think about how can we tell that full story, because it's not just going to be questions. I might need to pull some figures in there, and I might need to look up some things ahead of time, and I might need to tell my personal experience. I think about an episode that I did recently with someone from the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and it was about how we can counter anti-LGBTQ rhetoric that's being used against preventionists in the schools. And I could write some questions around that and it would resonate with some people. What we chose to do was to connect that with a historical weaponization of the language in our movement to harm marginalized folks, especially Black and brown people. And as I wrote those questions, I realized that it would probably be really important for me to talk about how I didn't know a lot of that stuff until I made the episode. Because I know that I may be speaking to someone who also didn't know any of that stuff. And if I can own it and say, I have to learn, you have to learn, while uplifting other voices, then I hope that that tells a little bit more of an authentic story. People want to connect with our stories. They want to connect with our authenticity. And I cracked some jokes about being gay and being in Target and live, laugh, lesbian. And I think they landed well. And I also talked about my shame, and that was important for me. And I'd be really curious from you both, before we move on to talking about the larger storytelling in our movement, can you share a memorable moment or podcast episode that felt a little bit more personal to you?
See, I think I'm like freezing up because I'm like speaking to the problem of why it's hard to be personal. So I mentioned earlier when we first started, we had a little bit of a larger team when the podcast first started. Leah was part of that team. And they really were my cheerleaders in terms of tell some of your stories too, to help contextualize what other folks were talking about. And we were having a conversation internally about tokenization and what happens when white folks ask you to do something just because you're Mexican. So I'll tell this story. So I had recently moved to San Diego, and if folks haven't been to San Diego, they have Chicano Park there. And so they have a bunch of different murals painted by mostly Latino or Mexican artists. And one of the first things I did was go there by myself and take a bunch of pictures and post them on Instagram. And I got a DM from a white feminist I'd been following for a long time. And she's like, hey, can you come give the kids I'm mentoring a tour of Chicano Park? And I was like, I don't know anything about Chicano Park. All I did was take some pictures. They were cute, I know, but I do not know the history. I haven't even lived in San Diego for a month. And at the same time, for some reason, I felt a little bit flattered that I was like, oh, she thinks I know. And at the same time, I was offended. I was like, I don't know. And so I'm telling this story in our meeting, and they're like, well, you have to tell that story now. And I was like, are you sure? Like, I'm not sure that I need to tell that story. And so I wrote up this story and I included it in the podcast, and I was like, what if she hears this? And I was like, well, I guess she needs to hear it. But that's, I think, I don't even think what's memorable was in the podcast, but it was the conversation that I had with my colleagues about telling my story and being able to explain the complexity of when someone gives you an opportunity, do you say yes or no? And why is it difficult to say yes or no? And I think for me, as a people pleaser, as someone who wants to say, yes, 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 I'll do that for you, it's very difficult to say no to something when you feel like you're not going to get another opportunity. And thank God I said no, because I've gotten so many better opportunities after that.
If you're looking for more content like this, head to PreventConnect.org. We've got tools, guides, and resources on how to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence in your community, all for free and in one easy-to-access digital space. From live web conferences and recordings to a running blog, resource library, e-learning, and online community, PreventConnect has everything you need to implement and evaluate innovative prevention initiatives in your community. All of that and more available for free at PreventConnect.org.
What's a memorable story you can remember from the podcast?
There are too many to pull from. Probably from season 2. I don't remember which episode it is. I confused the two, but there's an episode where we talk about community coming together in response to a sexual violence and a homicide, and the organizing that, I want to say, Chilean women and Mexican women did with "You Are the Rapist," and that it became this global chant. People remember that? Okay. And we talked about that and whenever I hear it, I just get chills, because it was such a powerful moment of challenging abuses of power. And I just wanted for Valor to extend the life of that particular moment, right? It was a moment, a lot of people, it came in and it's lingering, right? But it's not front and center the way that it was a couple of years ago. And similar to Me Too, I mean, we know what it is, but it's not front and center in the way in which it was for a particular moment. And I think that for me, I like the fact that Valor wants to extend those moments and let them recirculate, and so we can return to them. I think a powerful moment was, and it might be the same episode, Exploring Accountability in season 2, where we talk about Kobe Bryant and his legacy, and what do we do with people who have done really fantastic things in the world, but then also have done some horrible things. And what was important to me about that moment was, and for those of you who are adherents to restorative justice, it was a good lesson in how we pay attention to the fact that we can't monsterize people who cause harm, that because these people are our family members, they're our neighbors, they're our coworkers, they are people that are in our lives, and we can't just ship them all off to Alcatraz. That's not even, and particularly for certain communities, that is really problematic. Just punish, ship people away, invisibilize them. No, these are family members. The restorative justice asks us to hold the folks who cause harm accountable, but don't erase them, right? Especially if they continue to have value. So it was a moment, talking about Kobe Bryant was a moment that allowed us to really kind of illustrate that.
And you mentioned this earlier, Leah, as we kind of transition into the last part of our conversation, which is what are the stories we want to elicit and to bring some of you in on storytelling. We are up here for a lot of reasons, but we're mainly up here because we need some podcast guests and we need people to be excited about telling their story, whether you're on our podcasts or someone else's or at a city council meeting or talking to your neighbor or your friend or your uncle at dinner. We need more people talking. So we need to have a conversation about stories and the stories that we want to see. We've talked a lot about the stories that we don't need to see, right? We're not asking people to go out and disclose their own trauma. We're not asking people to tell the personal stories of the clients that they work with, even though that's what storytelling has historically looked like. So if we're not doing that, what are we asking people to do? What are the stories we want to see?
So we want to elevate the work that you all do. And so shortly, we're going to pass around a piece of paper and have you put your name, your email down if you would like to consider telling your story or one of your experiences as an advocate. And so I will lead by example very quickly. New hotline advocate, brand new on the hotline. And this is kind of like, think about your own experience. So I'm brand new, young, excited. I'm going to be helping people. And I've got my referral booklet. Got the phone. This is before cell phones. So I've got my referral book with all the services and everything. And I'm sitting there. I've told everybody, go away. Don't call me for the next 4 hours. I'm going to be on shift. And the phone rings and ring, ring, ring. Hello, this is Leah. Are you in a safe place? Yeah. I want to know if you could tell me where I can get some bars to put on my windows. This is the rape and battering hotline. Yeah, I know. And I want to know if you could tell me how to get some bars to put on my windows. Well, I just want to make sure that you're in a safe place and that you're okay. And, if there's stuff that you want to talk about, yeah, I want to know how I can get some bars on my windows. Okay. Hold, please. I go get the yellow pages. Back when we had yellow pages. I pull out the yellow pages and I flip it open and I go, what part of LA are you in? I'm in this part of town. Flip through the pages. I said, there are a couple of options available in your neighborhood. Do you have a pen and a piece of paper? Yeah, go. Bob's bars and window protection, Stephanie's security program. I give her 5 or 6 different options. Okay, thank you. Click. That was really illuminating for me because people are going to call the hotline with various reasons, and sexual assault is impacting people in different ways. And I'm just glad that I was on the other end of the call to get this woman some information about she could have pulled out the yellow pages herself. Clearly she had experienced some abuse or some violence or something, some trauma. And her solution was to put bars on her windows. And I, as the advocate, needed to meet her where she was at and get her what she needed. We all have stories like this, don't we? I mean, I have some that are far more dramatic than that. We as advocates have a million of these. And there's a way to elevate the work that you all do as a way of making people pay attention so that we can make sense of the world. So I know you all have stories. So if you're interested in sharing, really telling the story of the advocate, not your grant proposal jargon. Don't want to hear your grant proposal jargon. Don't want to hear, your $50 words, although you're all very, very smart. But really, what drives you? What are those moments where you have been affected or touched in some way that you feel that you can share as it relates to doing this work and why it's so meaningful?
I want to hear the story of prevention. Being a national technical assistance provider, even the word technical assistance provider, that doesn't resonate with people. Being someone who helps to build capacity to do prevention and talks to community members and new prevention educators and hopefully policymakers. I want to hear stories of what prevention actually looks like in practice, because we have this high level terminology. Those things do not resonate with people. We need to find ways to tell the compelling stories that's happening on the ground. So I'll give an example. When I was doing local rape crisis work, we started doing comprehensive sexual health education. And it was really hard for me to get people to understand the connection between comprehensive sex ed and sexual violence prevention. We used to do this thing when we did our sex ed that we did anonymous question boxes and we'd leave them there and we'd come back the next day. And I remember one day the specific series of anonymous questions that I got. The first one that I got, my brother told me that eating bananas would make my penis get bigger. Is that true? Yes or no? I was like, good question. The answer is no. The second question was, you said this one thing during the chromosome exercise yesterday, and actually I went home and Googled it, and there is no such thing as an O chromosome. I think that was a space holder and you forgot to fix it. It's actually an XX chromosome, so you should correct yourself. I was like, okay, yeah, you're correct. I was wrong. Or the third question said, I've been in a relationship for 3 months. And after what you said 3 days ago, I think that my boyfriend might be abusing me, but I don't know what to do. And I'm having a hard time. What do I do? The fourth one said, I'm really having a hard time with your LGBTQ lesson. I want to respect my peers, but also I'm a Christian. And as a preventionist, I'm sitting here thinking, well, we know the evidence shows that homophobic bullying is linked to sexual violence perpetration later on. We know that if someone experiences violence when they're young, it's likely that they'll experience violence later on. We know that building empathy with peers and building bodily autonomy and knowledge of people's bodies prevents violence later on. I could tell someone that and they'll be like, yeah, sure. They might roll their eyes. People don't know what prevention is. And I have peers who are working with housing justice coalitions and who are literally writing checks and giving cash aid to people who are working at mutual aid fairs, who are working around the clock. And I need to tell those stories.
From there, we brought in people from the audience to tell their own stories of what it's been like to work in the anti-sexual violence movement. Out of respect for their privacy, we're going to keep those stories off air. But we aren't done yet. If any of this conversation resonated with you, or if you're interested in exploring how to tell your story of prevention, reach out to us. Well, reach out to me at jsargent@valor.us. Or you can send us a DM on the PreventConnect Instagram or Facebook. We say all the time in prevention that we're here because we imagine a world free of violence. Let's take that imagination outside of our movement too. I think it could be pretty cool. PreventConnect is brought to you by Valor US and the Centers for Disease Control. You can find more information about this episode along with past episodes, web conferences, and blog articles at PreventConnect.org. As we work to bring you more podcasts like this one, we need your help ensuring that this podcast and others like it reaches listeners like you. Take a second to rate this podcast wherever you're listening to it. That helps us show up on main podcasting pages and reach new listeners. And of course, if you have an idea for a topic that you'd like to see us cover, reach out to us and comment on this post on our Instagram page.